Okay, hello YouTube. Somebody asked me to do a video on how to play e5 against c4, and that's what the focus of this video is going to be. It's going to be on the ideas, it's going to be on the theory, it's going to be on how exactly do we play e5 against c4. So anyways, if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit the subscribe button and click on your notification icon. So you'll notice I said how to play e5 against c4. I didn't say how to play against the English opening or how to play the King's English variation. And that's because if you want to understand an opening like this, really you have to think about it in terms of what opening it actually is, which is it's a reverse Sicilian. So really you need to be looking at this. That's how you understand the positional ideas. And for the English opening in general, whenever you look up theory on the English opening, you're going to have to look up the theory based on what opening you're playing against it. Like if you're playing the King's Indian defense, you would have to look it up under the theory for the King's Indian defense. If you're playing e5 or a reverse Sicilian, you're going to have to look it up under the theory for the reverse Sicilian. It's the same as, would you look up d-pawn opening on like how to play d4? You'd probably just look up, how to play the Queen's Gambit or how to play against the King's Indian or whatever. So anyway, so this is a reverse Sicilian. That's what this is. When you play e5, this is Sicilian in reverse. It's if white plays e4, c5, that would be a normal Sicilian. So a lot of the ideas in the reverse Sicilian are the same ideas that you're going to run into in the Sicilian, basically just with colors reversed. And one of the main openings that you need to be familiar with is actually the accelerated dragon. Believe it or not, if you know a lot of theory about the accelerated dragon, that's where this comes into play. And actually, you can use a lot of the ideas that you use with black. You can use it against the accelerated dragon with the white pieces. It's totally legitimate to do so. You can even use them against the modern dragon. So anyways, let's just kind of dive right into the theory. So we have c4, e5. Now, right away, one interesting possibility is this move pawn to g3. So they can play g3 right away. Now, if they play g3 right away, it's actually possible to play this move immediately. You can play pawn to d5. So if they don't clamp down on this central square, you can immediately play pawn to d5. So the game that we're kind of going to follow here is we have this game, Ding Liren versus Magnus Carlsen. And this game continued. It went c takes d5, queen takes d5. We have knight f3, knight to c6. Notice that Carlsen is just getting this position in the middle of the board. Also notice that this type of position is actually similar to positions that you would get out of like the hyper-accelerated dragon, where they play like an early g6. And those positions aren't like horribly respected for black. In this case, white does have an extra tempo, and that extra tempo does mean something. You can see the computers giving an assessment of just barely slight edge white. So all these positions where you're playing a reverse Sicilian and white has this extra tempo, that extra tempo does matter. And that actually just gives you an idea of how solid the Sicilian really is from like a positional perspective. In the Sicilian, you have these two central pawns versus one. That's a long-term positional advantage. Really, a lot of times in Sicilian positions, all you need is one or two extra moves to consolidate your position, and usually you have some sort of advantage. So playing the reverse of that is actually somewhat appealing. So when you're playing kind of the white pieces, you have to sort of tone down how you're going to play against this Sicilian setup. And usually the idea pretty much revolves around just clamping down on this d4 square. Like almost all of these positions where we see these reverse Sicilian setups, regardless of the setup that black takes, the main idea is going to be to clamp down on d4, prevent the eventual breakthrough with pawn to d4, and if we can do that, then we're basically saying that we're at least equal because you're never getting your freeing break. So your 2-on-1 doesn't really matter because you're never able to utilize that. You're never able to regain your space in the middle of the board by playing pawn to d4. So that's essentially what people play for. So you'll get kind of a vague idea of how to do that in this first game. This is Ding Liren versus Magnus Carlsen, played back in 2020. Continues with knight to c3, queen d8. And right now, Carlsen's main focus is just getting his pieces out without any real aim in mind. It's just basically piece restriction. Just restricting white from expanding with pawn to b4, just restricting white from expanding with pawn to d4. So just basic piece restriction, basic development, just trying to catch up, getting everything out, just trying to maintain this equal position, doing absolutely nothing special at all, planting his knight on d4. This was always going to be the eventual goal. This is I've always called it, or I've always heard it called, the sort of Marco hop maneuver, where you move your knight to d4, they capture, you capture back, and then you're trying to get like a Maroczy-bind type of pawn structure, where you have pawns on c5 and d4, and you're putting pressure on e2. If you can pull all that off, you're going to have some sort of advantage. People on the highest levels don't typically allow that. As soon as they see the knight land there, they typically retreat their knight and leave your knight on this strong outpost. I know when a lot of like weaker players see this type of maneuvering, where somebody plants their knight on d4 and then somebody retreats their knight away, this is very confusing to them. But they just really do not want this pawn structure transfer. They don't want knight d4 followed by ed4. So what they want to do is they want to remove their knight from the target area, and then they eventually want to kick this knight with e3 and then have that knight removed from that strong outpost on d4, which is what happens in this game. And it happens relatively quickly. After c6, white immediately plays e3, which was probably premature. Probably knight on c2, e4 was better, as you can see kind of here in the notes. So knight on c to e4 was better, but this is just something that happens when people are just playing very principled chess. The idea behind knight d2 was to play pawn to e3. He just didn't realize that it wasn't the most playable position to do it. So, I mean, e3, correct idea, apparently wrong spot. So knight back, we have takes, and now as you can see, this position has advantage black, mostly because white isn't quite ready to play pawn to d4 yet, and this pawn is a weakness on the d3 square. So this is kind of one of those ideal conditions for black, where black is doing okay. So we have knight f3, we have rook d8, just pressuring that pawn. E4, bishop back to e6, and then we have bishop takes e5, which is apparently the question mark move. These tactics don't work out for white, as it turns out. After f4, we have Magnus grabbing this pawn on a3 and apparently being able to get away with it. Ding Liren goes after the center of the board. He plays pawn to d4, but this was also apparently a slight inaccuracy because it allowed the capture of the second pawn. So he should have just defended everything with rook b1. And now this is actually decisive advantage black. And Magnus Carlsen being given an advantage like this, these two protected passed pawns, these extra pawns on the queen side, and basically no problems with the position, was able to go on and win with the black pieces. Now, generally speaking, like if we just go back and we just look at the English setup, this reverse Sicilian setup with black, generally speaking, that's how these things go. So we're going to push in the middle of the board with d5 at some point. We're going to get this reverse Sicilian setup. We're going to clamp down on the d4 square. We're going to prevent play from white, and eventually we're just going to declare some kind of equality. But also, generally speaking, people don't play g3. Generally speaking, like I think the most popular way that people play is knight c3. And you heard me almost slip there and say knight c6, and that's because we can very easily compare this to an accelerated dragon. So if I bring up a reverse board of this, this actually would come from an accelerated dragon, and the move order there would be like e4, c5, and we'd have this, and then g6. So this would be an accelerated dragon. Knight c3 is a move here. You can play this way, and actually I do. I personally play this way. Knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, f3 is possible. And it's given as a question mark in a lot of books, maybe wrongfully so. I mean, bishop c4 is the mainline theory, which is supposed to be slight edge white. But actually, f3 isn't terrible. Like, it's given as a bad move, but it isn't terrible. And the whole point is, after castles, you still have this interesting available option to you. Like, if you studied the theory from the black side, where you're playing this reverse Sicilian, the same option is available to you to simply clamp down on this d5 square and just prevent black from playing d5. It's actually completely legitimate to play knight b3 here. And as a matter of fact, if black just plays a couple of, passive-looking normal moves, if black just plays something like d6 and then say queen d2, bishop e6, we're actually transposing to positions that Magnus Carlsen has played with the white pieces against a regular Sicilian, albeit from a different move order. So we can actually take a look at this game. This is a Magnus Carlsen game. This is Carlsen versus Martinovic. And it was in the Sicilian classical variation where we have d6, takes, knight here, knight c6, and then he just retreated. He just said, okay, I'm going to play knight b3, and I'm going to employ ideas that I play against the English. I'm going to employ ideas after c4, e5. So c4, e5 really is a reverse Sicilian. Because if you want to, you can even play like this with the white pieces. And as you can see, like the computer assessment doesn't think it's terrible. It's just giving it as equality. And it's basically the same idea. We just restrict the d5 square, and we'll see that in this game, like bishop e6, castle's queenside. We're just restricting d5, king b1, knight e5, nothing special, bishop e2, bishop d4, takes, bishop takes f6, knight d5, and we've planted our knight on d5. Everything should be fine. Bishop g7, h4, he starts conducting a kingside attack with a strong knight on d5. He's traded off his dark squared bishop, but that doesn't mean that he doesn't have some sort of advantage in the middle of the board. And we see these similar themes, like between the Ding Liren and Carlsen game, where the knight got to d5 and he wanted to kick the knight out. He did the same thing. He wanted to kick the knight out, e6, knight back to e3. We have the same weakness on d6. We see these repeating themes in both positions because the positions are essentially the same. They're just one tempo off. So then we have queen e7, h5, and then he exchanges, goes after the king side, but then he's also got this weakness on the e3 square, and eventually he was able to make the weakness on he was able to make the weak pawn sort of matter. Like, he ended up going after these weaknesses and brought his material to bear and ended up with a slight edge with white. And he's Carlsen, so he just kept at it for forever. It's a very, very slight edge here with white. He's got 3 on 2 versus this one pawn. White's slightly more compact pawn structure, and the fact that this bishop is temporarily biting on granite, and the fact that this king is a little bit more unsafe, should yield white something. But I mean, realistically, this position is equal. So, like, for my taste, playing sort of this waiting game with white, even though like this knight b3, these types of ideas, they're interesting and they're worthwhile. It's kind of the same as when black does it. You're just hanging back. You're restricting black's movement. You're hoping to maintain equality, and then eventually you're just saying, "Hey, I'm no worse because you can't play, d5 at any point. You can't break out in the middle of the board. You can't use your 2-to-1 majority." So if we go back to this main move here with knight c3, we see a lot of setups that happen here that black can play that also are kind of the closed variety. So it's the reverse Sicilian, but you're playing basically a reversed closed Sicilian. So after like knight c3, we would have knight f6, we would have knight f3, knight c6, and then say g3. So here's where life gets interesting. Probably objectively, the best way to play this, like even if I throw an engine on it, would be to turn this into like a reverse, open Sicilian again, to turn this into like a reverse accelerated dragon. But there are 2 bishop moves here that try to keep the situation closed. Like, you can play bishop c5 or you can play bishop b4. Now, of the 2, bishop b4 is probably the more positionally, sound. It's the more positionally grounded. So this is kind of a reverse sort of Rosalimo setup. And we see a lot of people take this reverse Rosalimo setup. There's been a bunch of games in this. A few come to mind. We have Wesley So versus Magnus Carlsen. You can just see this game right here. I'm just going to bring that up real quick. We have Wesley So versus Magnus Carlsen. Continued bishop b4, bishop g2, castles, rook e8, knight d4. Knight takes d5, e takes d5, knight to d4, knight d4, e takes d4, queen a4, a5, e3, and after b5, apparently, black was doing pretty good. The point, of course, being you can't play queen takes b5 because bishop a6. I mean, and this just in general is a pretty interesting position. Actually, the computer gives slight edge black or near equality with any number of moves here. Probably queen f6 is okay, probably bishop c5 is okay, but needless to say, black is doing okay here. He's going to end up exchanging off another central pawn at some point, or actually it wants to play something like queen f6. This is what the computer recommends. Queen f6 and then say d3, and then bishop c5, and just kind of maintain this pawn on the d4 square for a little while longer. And after a3, finally you can exchange, and then queen here is putting pressure here and here. with plenty of compensation for whatever is going on here. So this is one of the computer recommendations. So this is kind of interesting stuff. Magnus played instead. He played this b5 move, which I think is pretty good. And actually, this ended up leading to a draw as well. And you can see the computer assessment is giving this as fairly equal. The game continued queen c2, bishop b7, just targeting the central pawn. Then we have b3, queen g5, a3, bishop back to f8, bishop b2 takes. And okay, this is just dead equality. Maybe even a little bit better for black at this point. Okay, so if we go back again, kind of to our analysis board, like bishop b4 is pretty reasonable. You're basically playing like a reverse Rosalimo. So if you're familiar with the Rosalimo, and the reverse Rosalimo, what it's kind of going for is like almost like an exchange variation of the Roy Lopez in a lot of ways, a lot of similar themes to the Roy Lopez and a lot of things like that. And bishop c5 is very similar to some of the bishop c4 lines that people try in the closed Sicilian. So this is kind of going for similar stuff, where you play bishop c5, you're going to play d6, and you're going to play a6, and you're going to play kind of this slow developing chess. So it's kind of interesting that the move knight takes e5 isn't horribly menacing, as it turns out. Like if you play bishop c5 and you play this knight takes e5, and if you're not familiar with this, the idea is basically the fork trick. Like if knight takes e5, you're gaining a huge part of the center. Like if knight takes e5, you're gaining the center with d4, and this is good. And you can see that the engine also thinks this is good. It thinks, hey, you've got the center here. Having the center is good. White should have an advantage here. So you don't really want to play knight takes e5. Instead, what you're going to play is you're going to play bishop takes f2. And we're following an interesting game here. Vasilin Topolov versus Anatoly Karpov played all the way back in 1997, went down this path. It went knight takes e5, bishop takes f2, and then king f2, knight e5. And apparently, black just kind of has just enough compensation to declare that he has equality. And I say black has compensation. I mean, you'd think, hey, white's the one with his king. Well, that's the compensation. Black is the one that has to have compensation for the fact that he has fewer center pawns now. White has, these 3 center pawns, and black has these 3, and that means that white has the main 2 center pawns versus black's 1 main d pawn. So that means the positional advantage goes to white. White has the better center. This is usually what happens in the fork trick. But black has enough compensation just in terms of some temporary things going on. Mainly, he's gaining a tempo against this c pawn that is hanging right now, and some kind of longish term compensation. Like after b3, we're going to play d5, and we're going to be able to strike in the middle of the board before white can get a fair clamp on the center. And that means that black is at least going to have his fair share in the middle of the board, permanently, kind of for the rest of the game. So like after d5 and then d4, knight c6, in this particular game, the game continued h3, and that allowed the immediate castles, bishop g2, and then d takes c4, and it was difficult for white to claim that he had anything going for him at all, because now black is essentially equalized in the middle of the board. You can't take back right away because your d pawn is hanging, so you have to play d5 and then knight e5, and you're actually holding the pawn on c4, which makes life complicated and somewhat annoying, considering that black has a little bit of a development lead here, and the king is still weak. So the position is at the very least equal. The computer actually gives a slight edge black here. So the main positional idea of all this is when you play bishop c5, what you're looking for is just a normal move, not knight takes e5. You're looking for something like bishop to g2, and then you can either castle or play d6 here. I've noticed that most strong players just kind of give up the ghost. They don't bother castling, even though it is possible to castle and offer the fork trick for a second move in a row. You can just play d6 and just say, okay, you had one chance to do it, and I don't need to familiarize myself with all the other ways you could have done it. It's just a little silly. You can just play d6 right away. And now we're heading into territory like Magnus Carlsen versus Tomaszewski. So this is Carlsen versus Tomaszewski, and this kind of went down this road. It went d6, castles. We have a6, just playing things nice and slow. a3, castles, b4, bishop a7. d3, h6, bishop b2, rook b8, and this game just kind of looks like almost every single close Sicilian game I've ever seen, where the knight's on c3. So if you imagine the reverse of this, it would be the knight on c3 and the bishop on a2, where you shuffle the rook over so you can get the bishop out, bring the queen out, maybe exchange on these dark squares, eventually maneuver this knight back, play c6, d5, and all these positional ideas are pretty straightforward, except colors are reversed, so white's up a tempo. And again, this tempo probably does matter, so probably white has a little bit of an advantage here. But in this game against Tomaszewski, Magnus Carlsen was able to neutralize that advantage. Actually, it was Carlsen versus Tomaszewski, so Tomaszewski was able to neutralize that very slight advantage against Magnus Carlsen. So the game continued like this. We have all these very normal moves getting made. Nothing weird here, just kind of following through with the plan. Rook d8, simplification in the middle of the board, going for this exchange on g2 at some point, and now there's just nothing here. Black should be fine. There's just, everything is held, central control has been taken, there's no serious weaknesses in the position, everything should be okay. So that's basically how to play e5 against c4. What you're playing is you're playing a reverse Sicilian. You have the option to play open Sicilian, like a reverse accelerated dragon. You have the option to play a reverse hyper accelerated dragon, depending, like if they play g3 instead of knight c3. And you have the option to play sort of a closed setup, where you play knight f6, knight c6, bishop b4, or a closed setup with knight f6, knight c6, and bishop c5. And of course, having familiarity with how people play the white pieces in these setups will only help you in having familiarity with how to play the black pieces in these setups. So this is basically how to play a reverse Sicilian against the English. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. Hope you learned something new about chess. Hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.